The twin-engine Cessna 402 shuddered violently as Captain James Whitmore fought against the controls, his knuckles white against the yoke. Through the cockpit windshield, the endless green canopy of the Amazon stretched in every direction, a sea of treetops that seemed to mock his desperate attempts to maintain altitude. The right engine had died 30 minutes ago, somewhere over the Brazilian border, and now the left was sputtering, choking on contaminated fuel that had somehow made it past every safety check at the small airstrip in Manaus. James was 42 years old, a decorated Air Force veteran who had flown cargo routes across South America for the past 8 years, and he had never felt fear like this, not in Afghanistan, not during the sandstorms over Kandahar, not even during his first solo flight as a teenager in rural Montana. The altimeter spun counterclockwise as the Cessna dropped through 3,000 feet, then 2,000, the jungle rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. Before we continue with James's incredible story of survival, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. The impact came with a deafening crunch of metal and splintering wood. James had aimed for what looked like a clearing, but at the last second realized it was merely a gap in the canopy where younger trees grew. The Cessna's belly scraped across the tops of palm fronds before the landing gear caught on something solid, flipping the aircraft forward. James's head slammed against the instrument panel despite his harness, and everything went dark for what might have been seconds or minutes. When consciousness returned, he found himself hanging upside down, blood dripping from a gash above his right eye into his hair. The cabin was tilted at a 45-degree angle, wedged between two massive saber trees whose trunks were wider than the aircraft's fuselage. Through the cracked windshield, he could see nothing but green, leaves, vines, and branches forming an impenetrable wall in every direction. It took James nearly 20 minutes to free himself from the harness, his fingers fumbling with the release mechanism while his head pounded with what was certainly a concussion. When he finally dropped onto what had been the cabin ceiling, now the floor, pain shot through his left ankle. Broken or badly sprained, he couldn't tell which, but when he tried to put weight on it, the agony forced a cry from his lips that echoed through the surrounding jungle. The sound seemed to awaken the forest around him. Suddenly, he became aware of the noise, an overwhelming symphony of chirps, calls, buzzes, and screams from creatures he couldn't see. It was nothing like the forests back home in Montana, where silence often reigned between birdsongs. This was a living, breathing entity that pressed in from all sides. James forced himself to think logically, to push past the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He was a pilot, trained for emergencies, and while this situation was far beyond anything covered in his certification courses, the basic principles remained the same. Assess, prioritize, act. First assessment. He was alive but injured, stuck in a crashed aircraft somewhere in the Amazon rainforest with no working radio and no way to signal for help. The ELT, the emergency locator transmitter that should have activated upon impact, was silent. He climbed back into the cockpit, ignoring the pain in his ankle, and discovered that the device had been crushed during the crash. Its antenna snapped clean off. His satellite phone, which he always kept charged in his flight bag, had somehow disappeared during the impact, probably thrown through one of the shattered windows into the jungle below. Second assessment. Resources. James methodically searched the cabin, taking inventory of everything that might help him survive. He found an emergency survival kit that contained a basic first aid supplies, waterproof matches, a small knife, a compass, and a space blanket. There were 3 bottles of water meant for passengers he'd never picked up for this cargo run, and a lunchbox containing 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a bag of chips that his wife Rebecca had packed for him that morning back in their apartment in Miami. The thought of Rebecca, of his 12-year-old daughter Sophie, hit him like a physical blow. They would be expecting him to call when he landed in Bogotá. When he didn't, when the authorities discovered he'd never arrived, what would they think? Would they search for him? Would they even know where to look? Third assessment. Immediate dangers. The Cessna was leaking fuel. He could smell it. And while the engines were cold now, any spark could turn his shelter into an inferno. The trees supporting the aircraft creaked ominously, and he realized that the wreckage could shift or fall at any moment. He needed to get out, to get away from the crash site, but the thought of venturing into that green wall of vegetation with a bad ankle and no clear sense of direction filled him with dread. James had done survival training during his Air Force years, but that had been in the Nevada desert, not a rainforest. He knew the Amazon was one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, which meant it was also one of the most dangerous. Jaguars, anacondas, poison dart frogs, piranhas, caimans, bullet ants, wandering spiders, the list of things that could kill him was nearly endless. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in his ankle intensified, and James felt exhaustion creeping through his body. He checked his watch, an old mechanical Timex his father had given him when he got his pilot's license, and saw that it was 2:30 in the afternoon. He'd been in the air since dawn, and the crash had happened around 1 o'clock, which meant he'd been unconscious or dazed for over an hour. The realization that he'd lost time frightened him more than anything else so far. Concussions were serious, and he needed to stay alert, to keep monitoring himself for signs of worsening head injury. Using supplies from the first aid kit, he cleaned and bandaged the cut on his forehead, then fashioned a crude splint for his ankle using 2 metal strips he pried from an interior panel and his belt. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when James made his decision. He couldn't stay in the aircraft. It was too dangerous, too unstable. But he also couldn't simply strike out into the jungle without a plan. Instead, he would establish a camp near the crash site, somewhere visible from the air if search planes came looking, but away from the immediate danger of the wreckage. Using the knife from the survival kit, he cut away sections of the cabin's upholstery and gathered all the useful supplies he could carry. The 2 sandwiches were already looking worse for wear in the heat, so he ate them both, knowing he needed the calories and that they wouldn't last another day in these conditions. He drank 1 full bottle of water, then refilled it with what remained in the aircraft's emergency supply. That left him with approximately 2 liters of water total. Not nearly enough, but it would have to do until he figured out how to find more. As twilight descended over the jungle with shocking speed, James realized he'd made a critical mistake. He'd waited too long, spent too much time taking inventory and treating his injuries, and now darkness was falling, and he was still in the crashed aircraft. The temperature, which had been oppressively hot and humid during the day, began to drop rapidly, and he understood that he would have to spend his first night here in this precarious metal coffin suspended between 2 trees. He wrapped himself in the space blanket and tried to make himself as comfortable as possible in the tilted cabin, but sleep was nearly impossible. Every sound made him jump. The screech of night birds, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the ominous creaking of the trees supporting the Cessna's weight. Several times during that endless night, James heard something large moving through the jungle nearby, something that snapped branches and made low grunting sounds that he couldn't identify. Morning came as a gradual lightening of the darkness, the sun's rays filtering through the canopy in thin shafts that looked almost solid in the humid air. James's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size overnight, straining against the improvised splint, and his head still throbbed with every heartbeat. But he was alive, and that meant he had to keep going, had to keep trying. He climbed carefully out of the wreckage, using vines and branches to lower himself to the jungle floor, some 15 feet below. His first steps on solid ground sent waves of pain shooting up his leg, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to move. He needed to find water, real water, not just the bottles he'd salvaged, and he needed to create some kind of signal that rescue aircraft might see from above. The jungle floor was a different world from the canopy above. Here, in the shadows beneath the massive trees, the undergrowth was surprisingly sparse in places, but the ground was soft and treacherous, covered in a thick layer of decomposing leaves and fallen branches that concealed holes and obstacles. James quickly discovered that walking in a straight line was impossible. He had to constantly detour around massive tree trunks, walls of vegetation, and dark pools of standing water that could hide anything from leeches to caimans. The humidity was suffocating, and within minutes his clothes were soaked with sweat. He'd removed his pilot's jacket and tied it around his waist, but even in just his t-shirt, he felt like he was breathing underwater. By midday, James had managed to create a rough camp about 50 yards from the crash site, in a small clearing where a large tree had recently fallen, taking several smaller ones with it and opening a gap in the canopy. This was perfect for two reasons. The opening would be visible from the air, and the fallen tree provided both shelter and a source of relatively dry wood. He used the knife to cut palm fronds and constructed a crude lean-to against the massive trunk, making sure it was positioned to collect rainwater. And rain, he knew, would come. This was the Amazon, where afternoon thunderstorms were as predictable as sunrise. The water bottles were already half empty, and James's thirst was becoming desperate. He knew that dehydration would kill him faster than hunger, faster than most of the jungle's predators. He'd heard somewhere that you could drink water from vines, but he had no idea which vines were safe and which might be toxic. Every plant here seemed designed to either kill you or make you wish you were dead. He'd already brushed against something that left his forearm covered in painful welts, and he'd seen ants marching in formation across the forest floor that were easily an inch long, their mandibles looking like they could take a chunk out of his flesh. As if summoned by his thoughts of water, the sky opened up around 3 o'clock. The rain came with no warning, transforming from sunshine to deluge in seconds. James scrambled to position every container he had, the 2 bottles, the lunchbox, even his cupped hands, to catch the precious liquid. But it wasn't enough. The rain was falling so fast and so hard that most of it simply ran off before he could capture it. That's when he remembered a documentary he'd seen years ago, back when he was still in the Air Force, about jungle survival. The narrator had shown how to collect water using large leaves as funnels. James grabbed the knife and began cutting the biggest leaves he could find, some of them 3 feet long and nearly as wide. He arranged them in overlapping patterns, creating channels that directed the water into his bottles. The system worked better than he'd hoped. Within 20 minutes, both bottles were full, and he was using his open mouth to catch water streaming off the leaves, drinking until his stomach felt distended and uncomfortable. The rain continued for nearly an hour, a torrential downpour that turned the jungle floor into a shallow stream and made him grateful for the lean-to's protection. When it finally stopped, the humidity somehow felt even worse than before, and steam rose from the wet vegetation like smoke. James's clothes were completely soaked, clinging to his skin, and he knew they wouldn't dry any time soon. The constant moisture was going to be a problem. He could already feel his feet beginning to soften and blister inside his leather boots. Night fell again, and with it came new terrors. James heard something in the darkness, something that breathed heavily and moved with deliberate purpose around his camp. He'd started a small fire using the waterproof matches and some relatively dry kindling he'd found under the shelter of the fallen tree, and the flames seemed to keep whatever it was at bay, but barely. He could see eyes reflecting the firelight, low to the ground, appearing and disappearing as the creature or creatures circled his position. James added more wood to the fire with shaking hands, painfully aware that his supply of matches was limited and that he needed to keep the flames going until dawn. He didn't sleep at all that second night, just sat with his back against the tree trunk, feeding the fire and listening to the jungle's nocturnal symphony. Day 3 began with a realization that filled James with cold dread. No one had come looking for him yet. No search planes, no helicopters, nothing. Either they were searching in the wrong area, or they hadn't started searching at all. He tried to remember exactly where he'd been when the engines failed, but his memory was fuzzy, confused by the panic and the head injury. He'd been off his planned flight path, that much he knew, detouring around a storm system that had appeared on his weather radar. How far off course had he gotten? 10 miles? 50? 100? In the vastness of the Amazon, it could take weeks or months to search even a relatively small area, and if the authorities didn't know where to look, they might never find him. The thought of Rebecca and Sophie watching the news, hoping for information, maybe even thinking he was already dead, was unbearable. James had to do something, had to take action rather than just waiting to be rescued. But what? He couldn't walk out of the jungle, not with his ankle in this condition and no clear sense of direction. The compass in his survival kit told him which way was north, but that information was useless when he had no idea where he was in relation to civilization. Should he head east toward the Atlantic coast, hundreds of miles away, west toward the Andes, north or south along the river systems that he couldn't even see from ground level? He decided his best option was to stay put and make himself as visible as possible from the air. Using the knife, he began cutting away undergrowth in the clearing, expanding the open space. Then he dragged pieces of wreckage from the crashed Cessna to the clearing and arranged them to spell out SOS in letters that were each about 20 feet long. The work was exhausting, especially with his injured ankle, and he had to stop frequently to rest and drink water. But it gave him purpose, something to focus on besides his fear and pain. By the end of day 3, James had consumed the apple and the bag of chips from his lunchbox. His stomach growled constantly, reminding him that hunger was now joining thirst as a critical concern. He knew there was food all around him in the jungle, fruits, nuts, even insects and grubs that were technically edible. But he also knew that eating the wrong thing could make him violently ill or even kill him. He'd seen some orange fruits hanging from a tree earlier, about the size of apples, but had no way of knowing if they were safe. The risk seemed too great, at least for now. He would wait, conserve his energy, and hope that rescue came before starvation became an immediate threat. That night, the 4th night, James finally slept, exhausted beyond his ability to stay awake. When he woke at dawn, the fire had died to embers, and something had been in his camp during the darkness. Tracks in the soft earth showed where a large cat, probably an ocelot or small jaguar, had come within 10 feet of where he lay sleeping. The realization that he'd been completely vulnerable, that he could have been attacked and killed without ever waking up, shook him badly. He rebuilt the fire with trembling hands and vowed not to let it go out again, no matter how tired he became. The days began to blur together after that. James established a routine: wake at dawn, rebuild the fire, check his water supply, work on improving his shelter and maintaining the SOS signal, collect rainwater during the afternoon storms, try to sleep despite the sounds of the jungle at night. His ankle slowly improved, the swelling gradually decreasing, though it still couldn't bear his full weight. The cut on his forehead scabbed over and began to heal. But new problems emerged. His skin erupted in rashes from the humidity and the constant moisture. His gums started bleeding, probably from vitamin deficiency, and the hunger became a constant gnawing presence that invaded his thoughts and dreams. On day 7, James made a decision that terrified him but felt necessary. He would try eating some of the local food. He started small, with what he recognized as palm hearts cut from the core of a small palm tree. They tasted bitter and fibrous, but didn't make him sick. Encouraged, he tried some of the orange fruits, eating just a small piece at first, and waiting several hours to see if he had any reaction. When nothing happened, he ate more, and the sweet flesh was like manna. He had no way of knowing if these were actually safe or if he was just lucky, but at that point, starvation seemed like a more certain death than possible poisoning. The insects were harder to stomach, both literally and figuratively. James had read that grubs and termites were good sources of protein, and he found plenty of them in rotting logs around his camp. The first time he put one in his mouth, his gag reflex nearly won, but he forced himself to chew and swallow, trying not to think about what he was eating. They tasted earthy and slightly nutty, and while they weren't exactly pleasant, they were tolerable. More importantly, they gave him energy, which he desperately needed. By day 10, James had accepted that rescue might not come at all, that he might die here in this green prison. The acceptance brought a strange kind of peace. He thought about his life, about the choices he'd made that had led him to this moment. He thought about Rebecca, about how they'd met at a community college in Billings, Montana, both of them working night shifts to pay for classes. He thought about Sophie's birth, about holding her tiny body in his arms and promising to always protect her, some promise that had turned out to be. He thought about his father, a rancher who'd never understood why his son wanted to fly, who died without ever seeing James earn his wings. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. James had always been social, someone who enjoyed conversation and connection. Now, the silence of his own company was deafening. He started talking to himself, narrating his actions, having imaginary conversations with Rebecca and Sophie. He knew it was a sign that his mind was beginning to fracture under the strain, but he couldn't stop. The sound of his own voice, even discussing mundane tasks like collecting firewood or checking his shelter, was a comfort that helped hold back the darkness. On day 14, something changed. James woke to the sound of howler monkeys in the canopy above, their roars echoing through the forest like ghostly cries. But there was another sound beneath their calls, something mechanical and distant. He scrambled out of his shelter, ignoring the pain in his ankle, and strained to hear. There, definitely an aircraft engine, but far away, maybe several miles distant. He grabbed a piece of metal from the SOS display and began banging it against another piece, creating a rhythmic clanging sound that he hoped might carry through the jungle. He shouted until his throat was raw, waving his arms, jumping up and down despite the agony in his ankle. But the sound faded, moving away from his position, and within minutes it was gone entirely. James collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. They'd been so close, so agonizingly close, and they'd missed him. The disappointment nearly broke him. That afternoon, when the rain came, James didn't bother collecting water. He just sat in his shelter, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of hopelessness settle over him like a burial shroud. What was the point? The jungle was too big, too dense, too good at hiding its secrets. He was going to die here, slowly, and his body would be consumed by the forest, leaving no trace that he'd ever existed. Rebecca and Sophie would never know what happened to him, would spend the rest of their lives wondering, hoping, never getting closure. But as darkness fell and the sounds of the night jungle began their familiar chorus, something inside James stirred. It was a memory, a scene from Sophie's 10th birthday just 2 years ago. They'd gone camping in the Everglades, and Sophie had been frightened by the darkness, by the strange sounds of the swamp at night. James had held her and told her a story about a man lost in the wilderness who survived by refusing to give up, who fought for every single day because he knew his family was waiting for him. "People die when they stop trying," he'd told her. "As long as you keep going, as long as you keep hoping, you're still alive." His own words echoed in his mind now, a challenge and a promise. James forced himself to stand, to rebuild the fire, to drink water and eat some of the grubs he'd collected earlier. He would not give up. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Rebecca and Sophie deserved better than a husband and father who'd surrendered to despair. The days continued their relentless march. 15, 16, 17. James's body was changing, adapting to his new reality. He'd lost significant weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, but his muscles had become lean and efficient. His senses had sharpened. He could hear the approach of rain now, could distinguish between the rustles of harmless creatures and potential predators, could read the subtle signs in the vegetation that indicated where water might pool. He was becoming a creature of the jungle himself, learning its rhythms and rules. On day 19, James discovered something that gave him a new burst of hope: a stream. He'd been expanding his collection of edible plants, venturing further from his camp each day as his ankle continued to heal, when he heard the unmistakable sound of running water. Following the sound, he found a small creek, no more than 3 feet wide, flowing over smooth stones. The water was clear and cold, nothing like the stagnant pools he'd been carefully avoiding. He knew that even running water could contain parasites, but at this point, the risk seemed worth it. He drank deeply, then filled his bottles, then drank again. The relief of not having to rely entirely on rainwater was enormous. The stream also provided new food sources. James fashioned a crude spear from a straight branch and spent hours standing in the shallow water, waiting for fish to swim past. His first several attempts were failures, the fish too fast, and his aim too slow. But eventually, through sheer persistence and countless tries, he managed to spear a small fish, maybe 6 inches long. He cooked it over his fire that evening, and the taste of cooked meat, even this tiny amount, was transcendent. It gave him an idea. If he could catch one fish, he could catch more. He could supplement his diet with protein, could build up his strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. Days 20 and 21 passed in a blur of fishing, foraging, and constant maintenance of his camp and signal. James had developed a daily schedule that kept him busy from dawn to dusk, leaving little time for the despair and loneliness to creep back in. He checked his watch religiously, marking each day that passed with a scratch on the bark of the fallen tree. 21 scratches now, 3 rows of 7 each. 3 weeks lost in the jungle, 3 weeks of survival against impossible odds. On the morning of day 22, James woke with a fever. It had been building for a day or two, he realized, a gradual warming of his skin that he'd attributed to the heat and humidity. But now there was no denying it. He was sick, and probably seriously so. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with his injuries, and his head felt stuffed with cotton. He tried to follow his normal routine, but his strength was fading rapidly. By midday, he was lying in his shelter, shivering despite the oppressive heat, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. This was it, James thought with a strange clarity. This was how he would die, not from starvation or dehydration or predators, but from some tropical disease that his body had no defense against. Malaria, maybe, or dengue fever, or any of a dozen other illnesses that thrived in this environment. He thought about Rebecca and Sophie, tried to hold their faces in his mind, but the fever was making his thoughts scatter and reform in strange patterns. He dreamed of snow, of Montana winters where you could see your breath and the cold was so intense it burned. He dreamed of Sophie's laughter, of Rebecca's hands in his hair, of flying above the clouds where the sun was always shining and the air was thin and clean. Time lost all meaning. James drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally rousing himself enough to drink water or feed the fire, then sinking back into fevered dreams. At some point, he had no idea how long it had been, he became aware of a sound that didn't fit with the fever dreams, a rhythmic thumping growing louder, accompanied by a mechanical whine that he recognized even through his delirium. A helicopter. James tried to sit up, tried to call out, but his body wouldn't obey his commands. He could only lie there, watching through half-closed eyes as the shelter's roof seemed to vibrate with the rotor wash. Were they landing? Had they found him? Or was this just another hallucination, another trick of his dying mind? He felt hands on him, heard voices speaking English with American accents, felt himself being lifted onto something soft and secure. "We've got him," someone said, the words distorted but understandable. "He's alive, but barely. We need to get him to a hospital now." The helicopter's motion was nauseating, but James felt himself smiling through the fever. He'd done it. 23 days in the Amazon, 23 days of fighting and surviving and refusing to surrender, and he'd done it. As consciousness faded, he thought he heard Rebecca's voice, though he knew that was impossible, knew she must be thousands of miles away. But it sounded so real, so close, saying his name over and over like a prayer. When James fully woke, he was in a hospital bed in Manaus, with IV lines in his arms, and Rebecca sitting beside him, her hand gripping his, her face streaked with tears. Sophie was there too, looking scared but trying to be brave, so much like her mother in that moment that it made James's heart ache. The doctor explained that he'd been suffering from a severe infection, probably from one of the numerous cuts and scratches he'd accumulated during his ordeal, combined with dehydration and malnutrition. But he would recover. He would live. The story of his survival made international news. The search teams had been looking for him, the doctor told him, but in the wrong area initially. It was only when they expanded their search grid and brought in additional aircraft that they'd spotted the wreckage and his SOS signal on day 23. Another day or two, the doctor said, and James might not have made it. The infection had been that serious, his body that close to complete shutdown. Rebecca held him that night, and Sophie curled up carefully on the other side of the bed, and James felt a gratitude so profound it brought fresh tears to his eyes. He'd been given a second chance, an opportunity that most people in his situation never got. He would not waste it. He would spend every remaining day of his life making sure his family knew how much they meant to him, how their memory had literally kept him alive when death would have been easier. The Amazon had tested him in ways he never imagined possible, had stripped away everything except his will to survive. James had learned what he was truly capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. He'd discovered that the human spirit, when fueled by love and determination, could endure almost anything. And while he never wanted to experience anything like those 23 days again, he also knew that he was forever changed by them, that he would carry the lessons of the jungle with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes survival is simply about lasting one more day, collecting water in leaves, catching one more fish, keeping the fire burning through one more night. And sometimes that's enough.